Hello, this is Dan, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Saturday, January 10th, 2026 issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Starting with front cover news today, Minnesota, or actually from yesterday, Saturday, today is Sunday, Minnesota leaders call for state role in investigating deadly ICE shooting. Federal authorities who have launched an immigration enforcement blitz in Minnesota said they will re-examine thousands of refugee cases in the state. By Mitch Smith, Jasmine Ulloa, and Julie Bosman. With the Minneapolis area in a state of upheaval, Minnesota officials renewed their calls on Friday for state agents to be allowed to help investigate the fatal shooting of a woman by an Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, officer earlier this week. 2 days after the federal officer shot and killed Renee Nicole Good on a residential street, immigration agents continued to patrol city streets, public schools were closed, and the Minnesota National Guard was activated in what Governor Tim Walz's office described as a precautionary move. The federal government also intensified its scrutiny of the state in other ways on Friday. The Department of Homeland Security announced plans to re-examine thousands of refugee cases in Minnesota, framing that effort as a way to root out fraud. And the Department of Agriculture said it would suspend $129 million in payments to the state and city, citing investigations of large-scale fraud in Minnesota social service programs which have implicated members of the state's Somali diaspora. The White House also continued to defend the shooting of Miss Good, posting a cell phone video taken by the agent that showed the moments leading up to the gunfire. State and local officials pressed again for the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to be allowed to investigate the shooting of Miss Good alongside the FBI, as was initially announced following the shooting on Wednesday. But after the Trump administration and Minnesota's Democratic leaders sparred over the circumstances of the killing, state officials said on Thursday that state investigators had been denied access to evidence and were withdrawing from the case. Our ask is to embrace the truth, Mayor Jacob Frey said on Friday, adding that he was worried that the federal government had already concluded that the shooting was justified. Our ask is to include the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension in this process because we in Minneapolis want a fair investigation. The Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty and the State Attorney General Keith Ellison announced on Friday that they would collect evidence submitted by civilians that would be publicly posted online and could be used in an independent investigation. I've been on the phone and in meetings with law enforcement, justice leaders, and elected officials discussing ways to ensure a thorough and transparent investigation can occur and be shared with our office, Ms. Moriarty said in a statement. Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security Secretary, said on Thursday that state investigators were not cut out and that they, quote, don't have any jurisdiction in this investigation. State prosecutors would face significant legal and practical obstacles if they sought to file criminal charges against the ICE officer who opened fire. The tension in Minneapolis comes months into a campaign by the Trump administration to increase immigration enforcement in Democratic-led states and cities. In Portland, Oregon, another place singled out for criticism, Border Patrol agents shot 2 people during what they called a targeted vehicle stop. In Minnesota on Friday, a few dozen protesters faced off with federal agents outside a government building. Agents shot pepper balls at demonstrators who approached a fence, and at least one person was taken into custody by law enforcement. Later in the day, thousands gathered at a prayer vigil for Miss Good outside the Minnesota Capitol in St. Paul, where clergy members from different faiths urged people to respond to Miss Good's death with prayer, love, and action. In downtown Minneapolis on Friday night, several dozen anti-ICE protesters gathered outside a hotel, chanting, "No justice, no peace," and circulating flyers calling for an end to deportations. The shooting of Miss Good, a U.S. citizen, came after weeks of mounting disagreements and heated rhetoric between the White House and the Democrats who run the state. Over the objections of local leaders, some 2,000 federal officers were said this week to be deploying to Minnesota to arrest illegal immigrants and investigate fraud in state social service programs. On Wednesday morning, just days into the Stepped Up campaign, agents confronted Miss Good as she partially blocked a snowy residential street. When agents approached her SUV on foot and demanded that she get out, Miss Good disobeyed and began to drive away. A video analysis showed that Miss Good's vehicle appeared to be turning away from the officer who opened fire. Becca Good, Renee Nicole Good's wife, said a statement to NPR News that on Wednesday she and Renee Good stopped to support our neighbors. "We had whistles," she wrote. "They had guns. I am now left to raise our son and to continue teaching him, as Renee believed, that there are people building a better world for him, that the people who did this had fear and anger in their hearts, and we need to show them a better way," she said. The White House has described the shooting as a lawful act of self-defense, while Minnesota leaders have labeled the federal account as BS or propaganda and have demanded that ICE leave the state. "What we are seeing right now, it's authoritarianism," said Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, a Democrat who is running for U.S. Senate. The Department of Homeland Security has defended its work in Minnesota, which has continued since the shooting, and has pointed to the arrests of men who they said were in the country illegally and had been convicted of serious crimes. In the face of violent attacks, ICE law enforcement arrested pedophiles, rapists, and drug traffickers in Minneapolis, Tricia McLaughlin, a department spokeswoman, said in a statement. Attorney General Pam Bondi warned Minnesota demonstrators not to obstruct or attack federal law enforcement, saying, "Do not test our resolve." Officials in Minnesota said residents were angry, nervous, and eager for ICE to leave. As protesters have gathered by the thousands this week, both Mr. Waltz and Mr. Frey have urged them to remain peaceful, saying that they believe the Trump administration was looking for a pretext to send in federal troops. Early on Friday morning, city crews removed barriers blocking streets near the site of the shooting. Mr. Waltz activated the Minnesota National Guard on Thursday, but did not immediately send them into the streets. He said the soldiers would be prepared to assist local law enforcement officers if needed. He said there was, quote, "every reason to believe that peace will hold." State Representative Esther Agbaje, a Minneapolis Democrat, said that she hoped, quote, that the federal government kind of pulls back for Minnesota. "People are scared," Ms. Agbaje said. "People are not going to school. People are not going to work. People are not going to the grocery store. I don't think that's how people should be living." The ICE activity was especially noticeable on Friday in a part of South Minneapolis with many small businesses catering to Latinos and Somalis. Volunteers awaited on street corners during the frigid morning, shouting and blowing whistles at the first sign of federal agents. At one point, Somali residents comforted one another outside an apartment complex after they watched agents detain a neighbor. Video captured by a bystander showed 3 agents slipping as they ran on icy streets. The man they were pursuing stopped and dropped his shopping bags before agents wrestled him to the ground and handcuffed him. Nearby, a usually bustling Latino market was almost empty, with many stalls closed. When the faint sounds of whistles were heard outside, a cashier at one business exclaimed and put down a tray of baked goods. Soon, black SUVs carrying federal agents pulled into the parking lot. Employees scrambled to lock doors and close the blinds as security guard spoke to agents outside. The security guard said the agents told him they had been chasing someone who they believed had run inside. The agents were denied entry, he said, but pledged to return. Trump urges oil companies to speed work in Venezuela. The president met with executives on a day when the U.S. seized another tanker carrying Venezuelan oil. By Rebecca F. Elliott, Emiliano Rodriguez Mega, Eric Schmidt, and Michael Levinson. President Trump prodded American energy executives to quickly tap Venezuela's vast oil reserves on Friday, hours after the United States military intercepted another tanker carrying Venezuelan oil. The tanker, which American forces boarded in the Caribbean Sea early Friday, was the 5th that they had boarded or seized in the past month, as the Trump administration seeks to control Venezuela's oil exports. Mr. Trump said Friday afternoon in a meeting with oil executives at the White House that he did not expect more attacks on Venezuela after American commandos captured its president, Nicolas Maduro, in a raid on the capital, Caracas, last weekend. Mr. Trump praised the country's interim leaders but said that American warships, which he called an armada, would stay in place off the Venezuelan coast. Trump administration officials have outlined a sweeping but bare-bones plan to take over Venezuela's lucrative oil industry and have said they expect the country's new leaders to follow orders from Washington. Mr. Trump has said that U.S. oversight of the country could last years. In the meeting with American oil executives, Mr. Trump said their companies would rapidly rebuild Venezuela's dilapidated oil industry and bring millions of barrels of oil production to benefit the United States, the people of Venezuela, and the entire world. He said that U.S. oil companies would invest at least $100 billion in Venezuela. But it is not clear that oil executives are prepared to commit to that investment. Darren Woods, the chief executive of ExxonMobil, the largest U.S. oil company, emphasized the opportunities that Venezuela presents and the big hurdles it would need to clear to return to the country. We've had our assets seized there twice, and so you can imagine to re-enter a third time would require some pretty significant changes, Mr. Woods said at the White House meeting. Today, it's uninvestable. He said that ExxonMobil was prepared to send an exploratory team to Venezuela within the next few weeks if it received security guarantees. Other executives were similarly cautious. When pressed by the president, Harold Hamm, one of his closest oil industry allies, also stopped short of committing to work in Venezuela. It excites me as an explorationist, he said. Everybody has that in their blood. But, he added, Venezuela has got its challenges. Some oil executives have privately discussed the possibility of seeking some form of financial guarantee from the federal government before agreeing to establish or expand production in Venezuela, according to people familiar with their thinking. Oil executives are concerned about political instability in Venezuela. Since oil investments are often measured in decades, and companies would need to be confident that any deal would last long enough for them to turn a worthwhile profit. They point out that Venezuela has in the past seized foreign assets valued in the tens of billions of dollars. Exxon and ConocoPhillips are among the companies still pursuing substantial claims against the country's government. It's not that oil companies don't operate in risky places, said Luisa Palacios, a former chairwoman of Citgo Petroleum, a U.S. oil refining company owned by Venezuela's state oil company. It is the inability to assess the risk at this moment. The Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, suggested earlier Friday on Fox News that the U.S. Export-Import Bank might provide credit support for companies making large investments in Venezuela. The independent federal agency offers financing when private capital is not available. Late on Friday, Mr. Trump signed an executive order intended to block claims on the revenue from future sales of Venezuelan oil to ensure these funds are preserved to advance U.S. foreign policy objectives. The day began with U.S. forces boarding the tanker, this time in a pre-dawn operation in the Caribbean Sea that was carried out by Marines and sailors working with the Coast Guard. The American forces launched from the aircraft carrier Gerald R. Ford, a nuclear-powered vessel, and apprehended the tanker, the Olena, without incident, the U.S. Southern Command said in a statement. Once again, our joint interagency forces sent a clear message this morning. There is no safe haven for criminals, it said. The Olena had been sailing under a false flag registered to the small Asian nation of Timor-Leste, according to International Maritime Organization, a tactic that the U.S. has previously cited as groups for interception. The tanker had loaded a roughly 700,000 barrels of oil in late December and early this month at Venezuela's Jose Terminal, according to Kepler and TankerTrackers.com, two firms that track global oil shipments, whose findings were independently verified by the New York Times. A video of the U.S. forces boarding the vessel, posted by the U.S. Southern Command, showed the vessel sitting low in the water, indicating it was carrying cargo. It left Venezuelan waters late last weekend, defying a partial U.S. blockade on Venezuelan oil exports. On Wednesday, U.S. Special Operations Forces took control of 2 other tankers, including one, the Marinera, that was flying a Russian flag and was seized between Iceland and Britain and had been subject to seizure under a warrant issued by a U.S. magistrate. The U.S. authorities did not have a court-issued warrant to seize the Olena, according to an official familiar with the operation, who was not authorized to speak publicly. But last January, the United States placed sanctions on the vessel, then named Minerva M, accusing it of helping to finance Russia's war in Ukraine by moving Russian energy exports to foreign markets. I'd like to pause here for a moment in this article to just remind you that you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times, in this case the Saturday, January 10th edition, on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. With Mr. Maduro ousted from power, the United States and Venezuela said they were moving to reestablish diplomatic ties. A team of U.S. officials that included diplomatic and security personnel arrived in Caracas on Friday to, quote, conduct an initial assessment for a potential phased resumption of operations, end quote, in Venezuela, the State Department said. The United States has not had an ambassador to Venezuela since 2010 and closed its embassy in Caracas in 2019 after accusing Mr. Maduro of electoral fraud. Venezuela's interim government said on Friday that it was initiating its own, quote, diplomatic exploratory process with the United States and would send a delegation of diplomats to Washington. Venezuela has released at least 9 political prisoners since Thursday in what the head of its National Assembly called a gesture of peace. Rights groups estimate that 800 to 900 political prisoners are imprisoned in Venezuela, many under harsh conditions. The United States has also pressured the Venezuelan government to expel official advisors from China, Cuba, Iran, and Russia, American officials said. Despite that push, Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla traveled to Venezuela on Thursday and paid tribute to the Cuban and Venezuelan combatants who were killed on Saturday while trying to protect Mr. Maduro during the U.S. military raid. He attended a ceremony with Venezuela's interim leader, Delcy Rodriguez, and other senior government officials, underscoring the depth of the relationship the two countries have built over the last 25 years. We are united in love, Ms. Rodriguez said at the ceremony on Thursday. Our concept of homeland is that the homeland is humanity. We are not warmongers, we are statesmen and women. Amid escalating threats from Mr. Trump and others across the globe, Pope Leo XIV used an annual address on Friday to the diplomatic corps at the Vatican to condemn a diplomacy based on force and a zeal for war. Leo did not mention any world leaders by name, but his remarks were notable, coming after the U.S. operation in Venezuela and threats against Greenland, and on a day when Russia said it had attacked Ukraine with a nuclear-capable intermediate-range ballistic missile. Changing direction for a bit. Beef tallow, long a health pariah, rises to the top of the food pyramid. The new dietary guidelines give federal approval to a fat that has slowly caught on with consumers, even as doctors have warned against it. By Kim Severson. Beef tallow, a fat that both cardiologists and the federal government told America to avoid for nearly half a century, has become an unexpected breakout star in the new federal dietary guidelines. The rendered beef fat has been quietly growing in popularity over the past few years among cooks who like how it crisps fries and donuts, beauty influencers who smooth it out on their skin, and others who favor it for high-fat diets or believe it's healthier than oil pressed from seeds. On Thanksgiving in 2024, it was thrust onto the national stage. A barefoot Robert F. Kennedy Jr. pulled a turkey from a vat of boiling beef tallow and declared, "This is how we cook the Maha way," referring to the Make America Healthy Again movement he leads. 4 months later, Mr. Kennedy, the nation's health secretary, showed up at a fast food chain that pledged to cook its fries only in tallow. This relatively obscure cooking medium quickly became a political symbol for the Trump allies pushing for drastic change to the American food system. Now the federal government has enshrined the fat as healthy. "We are ending the war on saturated fats," Mr. Kennedy said at a news conference on Wednesday, where he introduced new dietary guidelines that will steer national nutrition programs for the next 5 years. The updated food pyramid he released flips the traditional diagram on its head. It downplays whole grains and moves protein and full-fat dairy to the top as foods to be eaten most often, along with fruits and vegetables. Beef tallow and butter, which is also high in saturated fat, are name-checked along with olive oil in the guidelines as cooking mediums to prioritize. The guidelines add that, quote, more high-quality research is needed to determine which types of dietary fats best support long-term health, end quote. A collective shudder rose from the nation's established nutrition and medical communities, which point to studies that show saturated fats can increase the risk of heart disease. The American Heart Association issued a counterstatement advising people to avoid tallow and other high-fat animal products to keep artery clogging cholesterol levels low. I'm all for eating whole foods, but these guidelines dismiss 75 years of research favoring diets higher in plant foods, wrote Marion Nestle, a New York University professor emerita, who for decades has been a leading voice in American nutritional policy. She and other nutritionists contended that the new guidelines on fat are simply too confusing to follow. Yes, the recommendations prioritize animal fat, but the actual amount of saturated fat you should consume remains the same as in previous guidelines, 10% of total calories, which is roughly 2 tablespoons for someone eating 2,000 calories a day. It would be difficult to keep intake that low and still meet guidelines that suggest eating more dairy and meat, Ms. Nestle said. Jillian Michaels, the fitness celebrity and a supporter of Mr. Kennedy, suggested that the guidance is not so hard to figure out. She advises people to eat mostly polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, like olive oil, and foods like fish, nuts, and avocados. Saturated fat is perfectly healthy in small amounts, she said. Beef tallow, Ms. Michaels said, is not the greatest thing under the sun, but it's way better than refined seed oils. Mr. Kennedy and others have denounced seed oils, including canola, soybean, and corn oils, claiming they contribute to inflammation and are processed with harmful chemicals. Decades of research has shown that consuming seed oils is associated with better health. For people who make and sell beef tallow, a golden age has dawned. Consumers spend $9.9 million on food-grade beef tallow in 2025, according to the data company Spins. Jars of it landed on the shelves of Costco this year, and big retailers like Walmart and Target sell it. Fat Brothers beef tallow sells for almost $20 for 14 ounces on Amazon, and business is brisk, said Izzy Pissarro, who started the Southern California company with his brother Felix in April. Sales have grown by double digits every month since, Mr. Pissarro said, with people buying it both for cooking and to use as a moisturizer. This is a category that got highly politicized all of a sudden, but we look at the market and saw all these other brands and thought no one was doing it right, she said. I think our country went to war against fat, and we're starting to learn that maybe that wasn't a good idea. Beef tallow is made by slowly cooking beef fat to remove moisture and other bits of tissue. Any beef fat can be turned into tallow, but the purest and least beefy-smelling version comes from the fat around kidneys called suet. Even more prized, it's suet from animals raised on grass instead of grain, which is what the Fat Brothers and most small batch producers use. Beef tallow headed Whole Foods' list of top food trends in 2026. Sales in 2025 were up 96% from the previous year, said Brooke Gill, who oversees the animal fats category for the grocer. Shoppers continue to explore its different culinary benefits and uses and appreciate the sustainability aspect of tallow as it supports a nose-to-tail approach to using the whole animal, she said. Jenny Harris is a fifth-generation rancher whose father in the late 1990s transformed their small conventional cattle feeding operation in South Georgia to an organic one where cows are raised on pasture. She remembers a time when they had no market for the fat from the animals they slaughtered. We damn near gave it away, she said. They started turning it into soap as their grandmother did, and they discovered it made good candles, but beef tallow was still a tough sell. Whole Foods, which for a time bought their White Oaks pastured beef, wouldn't touch tallow products. Interest in tallow started picking up around 2018, she said. It exploded after Mr. Kennedy deep-fried his turkey. Now the farm has barely enough to satisfy both its soap and candle customers and its raw tallow fans. I was so excited to see the food pyramid flip, she said. Regardless of your political affiliation, what we had wasn't working. She thinks tallow's new recognition is great, but hopes lard, which she prefers to cook with, gets its moment in the sun. There is always the sexy one and the funny one, she said. Beef fat is getting to be the sexy one, but lard is pretty fun. U.S. hiring continues at modest pace, but weaknesses are evident. The unemployment rate fell in December, but job growth across 2025 was the lowest in 5 years. By Tallman Joseph Smith. The American labor market has entered 2026 in respectable shape, continuing to muddle through challenges even as it loses strength. Employers continued to hire modestly in December, and the unemployment rate declined, federal data showed Friday. But hiring across 2025 was the weakest in 5 years, driven in part by government staffing cuts and tumultuous public policy. Employers added 50,000 jobs in the last month of 2025, and the unemployment rate fell to 4.4%, the data showed. Average hourly earnings grew at 0.3% on a monthly basis in December and 3.8% on an annual basis, an acceleration compared with previous months. The report was the latest in a run of economic updates after several releases were delayed or canceled because of the federal shutdown. Those updates on the economy have demonstrated resilient growth in spending but prolonged softness in the labor market. Excluding healthcare and social assistance sectors that added about 700,000 jobs last year, private sector growth for the year was just over 20,000, said Samuel Toombs, the chief U.S. economist at Pantheon Macro, a research firm. These jobs are, to my mind, more a measure of demographics in an aging society than they are a measure of consumer or business confidence, said Leah Taniguchi, the research director at Bullhorn, a cloud-based software provider for the staffing and recruitment industry. If you look at professional roles, you are still seeing an awful lot of weakness, she said. The labor market has deteriorated over the past year, in particular for new graduates and others who are looking for work. And people with jobs are hanging onto them tight. Nearly every week, data on new jobless claims across all 50 states has shown that firings remain low. The unemployment rate inched up throughout 2025. Still, the labor force participation rate for people in their prime working years between the ages of 24 and 65 remains at a relatively solid 83.8%. Healthcare and social assistance continue to lead the way for payroll growth. There were 27,000 job gains for the month in food services and drinking places. Healthcare employment rose by 21,000. Job growth in most other industries, however, was mild or had reversed. Guy Berger, the director of economic research at the Burning Glass Institute, a firm that evaluates labor markets, has noted that the rate of hiring is around the pace of that in 2010 to 2011, when the unemployment rate was north of 9%. The retail sector lost 25,000 jobs in December. Employment in the manufacturing sector dropped by roughly 8,000 jobs last month and has fallen by the tens of thousands of positions since December 24, despite President Trump's promises that tariffs would lead to a boom in reshoring American factory employment. And although private sector job gains remain positive, average total growth over the last 3 months appears to be slightly negative. Right beside the labor market softness, though, are the latest numbers on growth, which remain strong. Gross domestic product, the standard measure of total economic activity, grew at a 4.3% annualized pace in the third quarter, and productivity, a measure of output per employee, grew by 4.9%. Most analysts expect that this momentum moderated in the last 3 months of 2025, but they still expect growth in the $30 trillion area. U.S. economy will register a respectable pace in 2026, above 2%, even as serious concerns about housing affordability and the general cost of living persist. The latest insight into the nation's employment situation solidified expectations that the Federal Reserve officials will keep interest rates on hold when they meet later this month. But intense deliberations are still likely over the next coming months, as some federal officials have made clear that they are more attuned to the risk of the labor market faltering. The persistent reduction in job openings and the increase in the long-term unemployment over the past year suggests the weakest labor market since mid-2017, said Ernie Tedeschi, the chief economist at Stripe, the financial tech firm, who worked for the White House Council of Economic Advisors during the Biden administration. The labor market was certainly not recessionary in 2017 and not even bad, but it was meaningfully looser than what we later experienced, he said, during the tight, worker-friendly labor market just before the pandemic. A cyclical slowdown is undeniable in the data. Still, artificial intelligence may also be making its earliest structural marks on the economy, as sectors that are particularly exposed to AI are showing signs of weakness. Professional and business services, which include industries such as computer systems design and advertising, lost 9,000 jobs in December and 97,000 jobs in 2025. When I talk to the CEOs of companies, they tell me, "We don't need to hire right now because of AI," said Joseph Brusalis, chief economist for the accounting firm RSM. It's a positive productivity shock. The sharp drop in immigration flows as a result of Trump administration policy has made it more difficult to assess growth in the labor force. And other forces resulting from Mr. Trump's agenda are complicating forecasts for the job market this year as well. The Supreme Court is expected to rule soon on the legality of tariffs Mr. Trump implemented on the basis of national security. Many small and mid-sized businesses in particular are hopeful that the tariffs will be struck down. That could provide some price relief to firms and potentially free up money to hire more workers. The White House, however, has signaled that it could raise tariffs through other legal avenues and statutes if the 2025 tariffs are struck down. Many tens of millions of Americans are feeling the pinch of high rents and the lack of affordable homes available for sale. But roughly 2/3 of U.S. householders are homeowners, and most of them have fixed monthly mortgage payments or no mortgage at all. Credit card data shows that lower-income households have pulled back on discretionary consumption as they attempt to budget for a higher cost of living. The affluent, however, are spending freely enough to keep afloat overall national data on consumption. That could reflect their relative sense of job security, too. We're seeing a shift toward more higher-level strategic roles, but away from things that probably can be automated, said Ms. Taniguchi, the research director at Bullhorn. When employers are in a picky mood, job seekers often just take what they can get, even if it means a series of part-time jobs, temporary self-employment, or gig work. I know a bunch of people who are like, well, I'm working as an Uber driver even though I'm a coder because I've been out of work for 10 months, Ms. Taniguchi said. Talman Joseph Smith is a Times economic reporter based in New York. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And now, a little section about work circumstances. Why doesn't my boss respect sick days? Plus the impossibility of being a middle manager. By Max Reed. Send questions about the office, money, careers, and work-life balance to workfriend@nytimes.com. Include your name and location or request to remain anonymous. Letters may be edited. The boss who needs to be a boss. I work a retail job. I have, on the surface, a good relationship with my manager. We work well together and we talk to each other about our personal lives. But whenever I've come down with a cold or the flu, which happens a few times a year, he doesn't show much understanding. If I'm at work and say that I'm feeling sick, he doesn't ask if I need to go home. Furthermore, the onus is on me to find someone to fill in the next day. I've worked while sick and masked before because I felt pressured to. I realize that I should speak up for myself and enforce a clearer boundary, but I'm hesitant to do so. When I get sick and need a day off, he sometimes says things that imply that I'm letting him down, and he has complained to me that workers take too much time off, leaving him to fill in. On the other hand, he often arrives to work late or leaves early, at times without explanation. What's the best thing to do to avoid this situation in the future? Am I wrong to think that it's the manager's responsibility, not mine, to find coverage when I'm sick? Anonymous. You're not wrong. In fact, in New York and California, it's illegal for your employer to require you to find a replacement as a condition for taking paid sick leave you're owed, even as a part-time or seasonal worker. Elsewhere, workplaces may differ. But even in states with less empowering sick leave laws, or those with none at all, staffing is usually a managerial responsibility for the obvious reason that when you're sick, you should be resting and recovering rather than scrambling to find shift coverage, or worse, working in public with an infectious disease. Is this annoying for managers? No doubt. But, well, that's why they're paid more than you. Like a lot of bad managers, yours wants to have it both ways, to get paid more money without extra responsibility, and to be your buddy while still wielding power over you. He wants to use your ambiguous but pleasant and interpersonal relationship to set the terms of what is, in fact, a clear professional relationship. This is exactly backward. A real friendship in the workplace can be cultivated only in the context of a settled professional relationship. He may not be consciously aware of what he's doing. In a sense, you're training him to act like this by hesitating to enforce a clearer boundary. When you give in to his pressure, you're showing him that a small amount of friendliness and a heavy dose of guilt are all he needs to offload his annoying duties onto you. But I don't think you need to have a one-on-one meeting or workplace summit to address this problem. If anything, I think you need to communicate with your manager less. Don't give him emotional leverage or opportunities for negotiation, like excessive description or apology. I'm sick and I can't make it to work tomorrow is more than sufficient. Ignore any implication that you're letting him down. Working is not a favor you're doing for him, and if he explicitly asks you to find coverage, simply tell him, "I'm not in a position to do that. I'll leave it to you." This might make him angry or frustrated, but setting boundaries is always uncomfortable, especially when one party has benefited from their absence. The good news is that his laziness works to your advantage too. Is a guy so allergic to doing his job really going to go out of his way to fire you, given how much extra work that will create for him? The plight of the middle manager. I am a middle-level manager for a business that has locations across the country. My employees here seem reasonably satisfied with the local situation, but often directives from the corporate offices are annoying at best and obstructive at worst. The corporate office puts a great deal of stock in our annual worker satisfaction survey, which does not distinguish between what the employee likes about the corporate office and the local office. They have come down on our local leadership because our latest survey showed a lower satisfaction rate than the rest of the company. The negative comments on the survey were directed toward corporate policies, and our retention rate is one of the highest in the company. Yet because the overall score was low, we have to come up with a remediation plan. I feel caught. If we emphasize that our local office is doing well, and it is a corporate problem, we are accused of fostering an us against corporate culture. Yet it seems like our worker complaints are something we can't solve. Help. By Anonymous. I suspect that many readers breathed a heavy sigh of recognition at this letter, which describes a familiar dynamic for middle managers, being caught between the frustrations of their employees and the idiocy of their bosses. You deserve credit for reaching a state of reasonable satisfaction, the most any manager can really hope for, at your satellite office. It's exceedingly frustrating for that accomplishment to somehow become a liability. Unfortunately, such is the lot of middle managers, whose duty it is to absorb dissatisfaction from below and insanity from above, and never ever complain. For better or worse, ensuring that your employees and your bosses are never in close enough contact to begin strangling each other is the actual substance of your job. I can understand why this situation is stressful. One option, of course, is to take your bosses literally. If they don't care about employee retention, but do care about employee satisfaction based on surveys, one straightforward solution would be to find new, presumably more satisfied employees. Letting go of people simply to satisfy your corporate overlord's need for positive survey results would likely be bad for the company and worse for your soul. On the other hand, what's bad for the soul is often quite good for the career. Many middle managers have succeeded simply by acting as henchmen for upper management. But I can't recommend that course of action. Among other things, it would be an enormous amount of extra work for you. Instead, perhaps you can turn the remediation plan in your favor. Rather than see it as a punishment, think of it as a means of advocating for yourself. An important tool in any middle manager's kit is bureaucracy, and making your case in the context of this bureaucratic process will go a long way to easing the pressure you feel. Whatever kind of documentation is produced for this remediation plan should lead with your retention rates and include specific complaints about corporate policies from your employees. Even better, you can try to organize the remediation plan around innocuously positive ideas, like improving communication between employees and corporate leadership, or ensuring employee feedback reaches decision makers. Make it pointedly constructive and slather it in enough bland corporate speak, and perhaps you can avoid the accusation of an us against corporate culture. If nothing else, it might buy you time until the next idiotic corporate intervention. The next phase of Trump's renovations, a new Upper West Wing. Besides changes to the White House, President Trump also said he plans to tear up the brick walkways in Lafayette Park and replace them with granite. By Katie Rogers, Luke Broadwater, Zolan Keno-Youngs, and Tyler Pager. It turns out there was another reason President Trump was memorably taking a little walk along the White House roof in August. I was looking at doing office space. After tearing down the east wing of the White House to build a lavish new ballroom, Mr. Trump is turning his sights to a more famous section of the White House. He wants to build a second level on top of the colonnade that connects the West Wing to the White House residence. In an interview with the New York Times on Wednesday evening, Mr. Trump said that he was calling the project the Upper West Wing. He said that it was currently under design and that if he likes what he saw, he would move forward. He said that the West Wing aides could have additional office space there or that it could be First Ladies' offices for future First Ladies. Later, during a tour of the White House residence, he said he planned to tear up the brick walkways in Lafayette Park and replace them with granite. I'm spending my own money and I'm going to redo it, Mr. Trump said of the park. He estimated the cost would be about $10 million. I pay everything, he said when asked whether taxpayers or donors would foot the bill. Mr. Trump said his decision to tear up the park walkways in part was because protesters could pluck bricks from the walkway and throw them. During a nearly 2-hour interview, Mr. Trump described not only his plans for a large ballroom that has more than doubled in size since it was first proposed, but also his ideas for more building projects. Those include the renovations of the West Wing in Lafayette Park, as well as the Washington Dulles International Airport, and the construction of a triumphal arch near Arlington National Cemetery, and a National Garden of American Heroes on the Potomac River. Yes, I'm going to make Dulles into a great airport, he said. Some of Mr. Trump's construction intentions came into clearer focus on Thursday during a meeting of the National Capital Planning Commission in which Shalom Baranis, the architect in the ballroom project, presented preliminary plans. Mr. Baranis displayed renderings of a ballroom that was equal in height to the White House's executive mansion, raising some concerns among commission members about the size of the project. Mr. Baranis said the possible addition to the West Wing would be limited to just the colonnade. He said such an addition could be needed to match the height of the ballroom project. I did mention the potential for a future addition, a one-story addition to the West Wing, Mr. Baranis told the commission, adding, the reason to think about that is so that we would reinstate symmetry along the central pavilion of the White House. Several members of the National Capital Planning Commission said on Thursday that they had questions about the size of the ballroom, which critics have said could dwarf the existing White House. Protesters of the ballroom proposal gathered outside the meeting, but Joshua Fisher, the director of the White House Office of Administration, maintained that the project was sorely needed and said the complete demolition of the East Wing was the best option available to Mr. Trump. Modifying or renovating the colonnade in the existing East Wing was not feasible for many reasons, Mr. Fisher said, citing instability in its colonnade, mold, and outdated electrical infrastructure. During the interview with the Times, Mr. Trump said one main point of construction, a new ballroom, was to have a secure site to hold an inauguration. He said it would have bulletproof glass 4 to 5 inches thick that can take just about any weapon that we know of. The president made clear that assassination attempts against him were on his mind. It's not like it was 30 years ago, he said. You've got to make a speech today. They got the long ranges. They can go 10 football fields, okay? He added. It's being designed very much with the inauguration in mind. It'll be able to hold 6 times what the Capitol can hold. And it's all bulletproof glass, drone-proof roof. Yeah, serious. The biggest drone could crash into it. You'd hear a noise up there. It wouldn't be bad. The renovations will include the secure area below the East Wing known as the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. So I started off with the building, half of the seats, then it just kept growing and growing, and the money kept pouring in and pouring in, Mr. Trump said of how the project has grown. I said, well, we've got all this beautiful land. I don't want to waste it, so I said, all right, I'll go a little bit larger. The president said the White House ballroom depicted in early renderings would have held only about 100 or 450 people. So then I said, well, okay, let's max it out. This is more like Trump, isn't it? Let's max it out. Even so, Mr. Trump said he rejected one model that was even bigger than his current plan. I would have the right to do that, he said, but I thought it was too big and it wasn't right for the site. Mr. Baranis said the final drawings would plan for about 1,000 seated guests. The project's price tag has also grown. Mr. Trump initially said it would cost $200 million to build, before raising the figure to $300 million and then $400 million. As for the planned National Garden of American Heroes, a sculptured garden that Mr. Trump proposed during his first term and that Congress allocated $40 million for in the One Big Beautiful Bill last year, Mr. Trump said he was eyeing a spot on the Potomac River. That's going to be most likely right on the Potomac River, he said. You'll see this, an area that is touching the golf course, he added. That hasn't been a final decision, but it's getting close. The president said the proposed spot for the garden was one of the reasons his administration moved to seize control of the municipal golf courses in Washington. Last month, the Department of Interior terminated a lease with the National Links Trust to rehabilitate 3 public golf courses, including East Potomac Golf Links. Going to be a beautiful complex, he said. Mr. Trump also made clear that he was immensely proud of a renovation of the bathroom connected to the Lincoln bedroom. You know the Lincoln bathroom, as an example. People, oh, Lincoln, it's a masterpiece, he said it, adding, I made it into what would have been used at the highest level, the most gorgeous marble. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. It's turning now to the opinion section. Guest essay. I'm the mayor of Minneapolis. Trump is lying to you. By Jacob Fry. Mr. Fry is the mayor of Minneapolis. On August 1st, 2007, the Interstate 35W bridge spanning the Mississippi River in Minneapolis collapsed into the water during rush hour. 13 people died and dozens more were injured. In the immediate aftermath, the president, a Republican, showed up in a city full of Democrats ready to help. Minneapolis leaders were passionate and vocal critics of President George W. Bush's policies at the time. But when the crisis struck, it didn't matter. We were partners in what mattered most, saving lives, steadying our community, and rebuilding infrastructure. Cities could count on the administration in a crisis. Politics stopped quite literally at the water's edge. Blue cities like Minneapolis used to be able to count on good faith partnerships with the federal government under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Under the Biden administration, our police officers worked with federal agents and the U.S. Attorney's Office to bring down shooting rates in North Minneapolis. The effort wasn't political, it was practical, and it continues to keep people safe. But such partnerships in both crisis and ordinary governance are not the experience of big city Democratic mayors under the Trump administrations. I learned that the hard way in 2020 during the civil unrest that came in the wake of George Floyd's murder by a Minneapolis police officer. I'll never forget the shock I felt when President Trump not only encouraged violence during the unrest but denied federal approval for disaster relief. On Wednesday, when I learned that a Minneapolis resident had been shot and killed by an immigrations and customs enforcement agent, I didn't feel the shock in my gut that I felt over 5 years ago. Nothing about this was shocking. The chaos that ICE and the Trump administration have brought to Minneapolis made this tragedy sadly predictable. In mid-December, ICE agents were filmed dragging a pregnant woman through the street. Heavily armed agents have been deployed to arrest lone individuals in public libraries and malls. Even in the aftermath of this week's shooting, ICE agents continue to spread chaos, apparently deploying chemical agents at a local public high school. The actions of the ICE agents deployed to my city are dangerous and now even deadly. But that danger has been compounded by the administration's claim that the victim committed an act of domestic terrorism. The Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem baselessly insisted the shooting was an act of self-defense. Mr. Trump falsely claimed that the victim, Renee Nicole Good, behaved horribly and ran him over, referring to the ICE agent. I've watched multiple videos from multiple perspectives. It seems clear that Miss Good, a mother of 3, was trying to leave the scene, not attack an agent. The Trump administration's false narrative about this week's shooting and the demonization of the victim are only part of a bigger lie. It wants the American public to believe that ICE's heavily militarized crackdown across the country is an effort to keep cities like Minneapolis safe. It is not. It is about vilifying not just immigrants, but all who welcome them and their contributions to our communities. By defending the lie about this clearly avoidable shooting in Minneapolis and refusing to allow Minnesota officials to investigate the crime, the administration is sending a message to the entire country. If you show up for your immigrant neighbors or even are simply present when those neighbors are taken, your rights will not be protected by the law and your life will be at risk. Under both the first and second Trump administrations, the country has learned from watching Minneapolis that the federal government holds no regard for cities or the people who live in them. When coupled with this administration's open attempt for democratic norms, indeed our Constitution, this is a threat to the long-term endurance of our republic. I hope no more of my fellow mayors find their cities in this administration's crosshairs. But for those who do, here is my advice. The best thing you can do is to build cities that work and love those streets and those citizens above any ideology. By bringing down violent crime, Minneapolis has been able to successfully push back against those who have tried to portray our city as a post-apocalyptic hellscape. By building housing and focusing on affordability, we have made our city a place that immigrants, transplants, and native Minneapolitans can all call home. By supporting immigrant-owned small businesses, our city has become living proof that immigrants make our city and nation stronger. Cities are on the front lines of this dark hour in our national politics. But after we weather this moment, and we will weather it, it will be on us to light the way forward. The best way to convince the country that welcoming and lifting up immigrants is good for its communities is by proving it in our own cities. We pressed Trump on his conclusion. We pressed Trump on his conclusion about the ICE shooting. Here's what he said. The exchange was a glimpse into the president's reflexive defense of his federal crackdown on immigration. And in this picture, there is a picture of Trump at his desk. Some reporters you can see kind of blurry because the camera's just behind their heads, and a picture of a woman holding a computer showing an image from the local news reporting on the shooting that happened in Minnesota. Just hours after an Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent shot a 37-year-old woman in Minneapolis on Wednesday, Mr. Trump told a group of New York Times reporters that the woman was at fault because she had tried to run over the officer. We were in the Oval Office for an interview with the president, and the unfolding situation in Minneapolis was high on our list of questions. As soon as we started asking him about the incident, he said, "I want to see nobody get shot. I want to see nobody screaming and trying to run over policemen either." When we pressed Mr. Trump on his conclusion that the victim, Renee Nicole Good, tried to run over the agent, he asked an aide to pull up the video on a laptop in an effort to prove his point. That was a vicious situation that took place, Mr. Trump said, apparently referring to what federal officials have said was an effort by Ms. Good to run down an ICE agent. The exchange was a glimpse into Mr. Trump's reflexive defense of what has become a sometimes violent federal crackdown on immigration, which in this case claimed the life of an American citizen who was protesting ICE's presence in Minneapolis. On Thursday, after our interview with the president, a Times analysis of footage from 3 camera angles showed the motorist was driving away from, not toward, a federal officer when he opened fire. But on Wednesday night, Mr. Trump stuck to his position even as we pointed out the inconsistencies in his account and the lack of clarity in videos circulating on social media. We asked if, in his mind, firing into a vehicle like that was acceptable. "She behaved horribly," Mr. Trump said, "and then she ran him over. She didn't try to run him over, she ran him over." We told the president that the early videos circulating online were unclear. "I'll play the tape for you right now," Mr. Trump said. Mr. Trump's aide, Natalie Harp, brought a laptop over to the Resolute desk to show us what he said would be evidence of the woman's wrongdoing. Before the video began, Mr. Trump acknowledged the tragic nature of the shooting. "With all of it being said, no, I don't like that happening," he said, before pivoting to his common refrain of criticizing illegal immigration. As a slow-motion surveillance video of the shooting played on the laptop, we told him that this angle did not appear to show that an ICE officer had been run over. "Well," Mr. Trump said, the way I look at it, it's a terrible scene," Mr. Trump said at the end of the video. "I think it's horrible to watch. No, I hate to see it." But did this fatal shooting mean his ICE operation had gone too far? Mr. Trump sidestepped the question, instead blaming his predecessor's immigration policies. Mr. Trump's willingness to make a near immediate conclusion about the deadly shooting appeared to be at odds with one of his senior advisors. Tom Homan, Mr. Trump's border czar, told CBS News that he would not make a judgment call on video of the shooting circulation on social media. "Let the investigation play out," Mr. Homan said, "and hold people accountable based on the investigation." Who wins from Trump's Venezuela oil gambit? Not regular Americans. This guest essay by Rebecca Patterson. Ms. Patterson is an economist who has held senior positions at J.P. Morgan Chase and Bridgewater Associates. Among his various justifications for removing President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela from office, President Trump has talked about taking control of the country's oil supply. Who will benefit from this? Maybe American oil companies that had their operations seized in 2007. Perhaps Chevron, the only U.S. producer active in Venezuela today. Beyond that narrow list, the answer isn't immediately obvious. Given the current dynamics of the global oil market, American consumers might not see meaningful near-term benefits, and big oil companies don't seem to be rushing to take advantage. There are at least 2 reasons U.S. oil producers may not move quickly on Venezuela's vast oil reserves: price and certainty. Even before the weekend's drama, American companies were pessimistic, according to a December survey by the Dallas Federal Reserve, with some noting a lack of clarity about America's economic outlook and low prices that make it uneconomical to operate certain wells. Only about a third of respondents said they plan to increase capital spending in the year ahead, while 20% said they expect to increase personnel. Higher prices would make it relatively easier for oil producers to take risks with new exploration. But with prices holding steady or possibly slipping, as the U.S. government's Energy Information Administration expects, oil majors are unlikely to have much confidence in the new ventures. Adding to their caution, Venezuela's oil infrastructure is creaking and inefficient. The country claims to have more than 300 billion barrels in the ground, the largest known reserves of oil of any country, but produces only about 1 million barrels a day, or around 1% of global production. Much of its oil is also a type that is extra polluting and expensive to process. That means that a decision to invest the billions required to rebuild the infrastructure needed to capitalize on these reserves would require not only prices high enough to make a return, but also clarity on the ground. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1976, and Chevron has been the only U.S. producer to maintain a consistent presence in the country. While it could certainly increase production over the course of this year, other companies will have a more difficult decision to make. Is the potential financial return attractive enough to offset the risk of future change in Venezuela's leadership or in U.S. policy? And is it more compelling than other opportunities, including within the United States? If we assume somehow that Venezuelan oil machine cranks up again, more supply could help push down oil prices over the coming years. This has already been happening. Brent crude oil prices, the global oil benchmark, fell nearly 19% in 2025. And well before the military action in Caracas, the Energy Information Administration published forecasts for even lower crude oil prices in 2026. It expects another year where increased global oil supplies outstrip demand growth, leading to Brent prices falling to an average of $55 a barrel, about 10% below the roughly $61 a barrel on Friday. This path forward for crude oil suggests lower gasoline prices, which means consumers will have more cash for other purchases. That's especially good news when the affordability of many day-to-day expenses like groceries, housing, and healthcare has become a major source of worry for Americans. Still, it makes sense to temper one's optimism. Lower prices at the pump are likely to be incremental rather than dramatic. Gasoline prices tend to fall less and more slowly than crude oil prices, in part as they also incorporate costs such as taxes and transportation. Last year, when Brent crude prices fell by nearly 19%, retail gasoline prices came down by only 8%, albeit with significant differentiation across the country. Lower oil prices would potentially mean lower inflation, which could marginally increase the odds of additional interest rate cuts by the Federal Reserve. The central bank officially targets inflation without incorporating food and energy prices, since those can be volatile. In reality, though, the Fed keeps a close eye on energy inflation, knowing it can influence inflation expectations and ultimately actual inflation. A federal rule of thumb is that a permanent 10% decrease in the price of crude oil can lower core inflation by roughly 1/10 of a percentage point over the following 1 to 2 years. Of course, there are many other variables that will influence inflation in the year ahead, and the central bank is highly unlikely to make any change before having ample data showing how oil prices flow through the broader economy. Financial markets already expect the Fed to cut interest rates by 50 basis points in 2026, double the Fed's own forecast published in December. Caution again seems sensible. For inflation and Fed expectations to meaningfully change on the back of Mr. Maduro's ouster, we need to see oil producers quickly and meaningfully respond to the scenario outlined in Mr. Trump's weekend news conference, when he said that U.S. oil giants would spend billions of dollars to fix Venezuela's oil infrastructure and start making money. That requires confidence that domestic politics in Venezuela will be calm and that relations with the United States will also be stable and productive. This scenario doesn't seem very likely in the near term at least. For the time being, the biggest winner of the leadership change in Venezuela may not be American consumers or oil producers, but instead the U.S. government itself. If it can successfully gain more access to Venezuelan oil production and all the geopolitical influence that comes with it. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 10th, 2026 issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Dan. Thank you for listening.